Hey everyone, we have Jesse Pelton here. He's the CTO of Hodl Ranch, and he'll be doing a talk on exploring opportunities for Bitcoin hash rate decentralization outside of China. Can you guys confirm that you can hear him once he starts speaking? Confirm in the chat.
Hey guys. Perfect. Okay, so today I'm going to talk to you guys a bit about the history of Bitcoin mining, how we got to a centralized situation that we're in today, where you see so much Bitcoin mining done in China, and how that trend is reversing now. So we're going to look at the history of ASICs, this centralization era, how Bitcoin mining in a very short period of time became very centralized, and how that trend is now starting to reverse with the commoditization of ASICs. And then we're going to go over a bit about the history or about the fundamentals of power grids, about how renewables are shaking up that a little bit, and Bitcoin mining's potential role in alleviating that. So if you look at the history of mining started out on CPUs, GPUs, basically home computers, gaming computers. Eventually, people started producing specialized hardware. But then when this specialized hardware was first produced, ASICs, application-specific integrated circuits, at first they were produced on old processes. And this made a lot of economic sense because you could prototype quickly. You could get a generation of machine out that had vastly better performance than something that was not an ASIC, but you could do it quickly and rapidly. But what this led to was this very quick generation cycle where every couple of months you would see massive increases in performance as the processes being used to print ASICs caught up to the rest of the semiconductor industry. So today we see that ASICs use the same processes as Apple and Samsung and the rest of cutting edge semiconductor technology. So ASICs today are using 7-nanometer technology, and further improvements are going to be toe in toe with the rest of the semiconductor industry. If we take a look at the geography of mining today, most of it is still in China, and this makes a lot of sense because China has been the main producer of these ASICs. So especially in this era where you had a lot of rapid development and massive improvements in ASICs, it was a huge advantage to be close to the manufacturers and to have those close relationships where you could set up new mining farms quickly as new equipment came out. So we're going to compare and contrast here sort of the history of this. We're looking at what Bitcoin mining looked like 3 or 4 years ago versus what it looks like today. So in the centralization era, the fundamentals that determined how to be profitable in mining were that the price is volatile and that new ASICs quickly made old ASICs obsolete. So the key to being profitable was being able to get a hold of these new ASICs and plug them in quickly, because even small amounts of differences in the time that you were running these ASICs could mean big differences in your long-term profitability. Now today this has changed quite a bit. So with the commoditization of ASICs, we've seen many more companies producing ASICs, and one of the great things about the SHA-256 algorithm is that there's not a lot of optimization to be done. So ASICs are all generally pretty similar in terms of performance, and that's generally based on the process that they're printed on. So what this has done is it's made it to where Bitcoin miners, instead of now competing on their ability to procure ASICs, are competing primarily on their cost of power and their scale of operations. To understand a little bit better this change, we're going to take a look at some just historical data about Bitcoin. We can see, Bitcoin has had massive price appreciation of multiple orders of magnitude over the last decade. And with that comes a significant amount of volatility. So that anybody who's doing Bitcoin mining has to anticipate that the amount of revenue that you're getting can change wildly in a very short time. Hash rate over time follows price. So when Bitcoin price increases, there's more incentive for miners to build additional mining farms, which increases the amount of hash rate. And conversely, when Bitcoin price goes down, higher cost miners are forced to turn off, which alleviates profitability on lower cost miners. In order to look at this a little bit more clearly, it's helpful to denominate things in terms of dollars per kilowatt hour or dollars per megawatt hour for revenue. So this is a chart that takes and looks at what was the historical mining revenue since from January of 17 to up to today of 16 nanometer ASICs, which is like an S9, and 7 nanometer ASICs, which is more like an S17. This is the same chart, just zoomed in a bit. And if you overlay hash rate on this, what you'll see is that there are several points here where you see drops in hash rate, and these correspond to drops in Bitcoin price or drops in block reward. So miners respond to these incentives where, for example, in late 2018, you saw a third of Bitcoin miners pull off due to the drop in profitability. So this insulates miners that are low cost from the volatility in Bitcoin price. So this is what made this era of Bitcoin mining so critically focused on cost of power. So there's two pieces there. There's cost of power and scale. So cost of power is the primary cost of any Bitcoin mining operation, but the scale of your operation is also important when it comes to reducing the rest of your costs. You have other costs in terms of OpEx that see massive economies of scale as you get larger. So just to recap on this last part, in terms of the decentralized era today, the main drivers of Bitcoin mining are the volatility in Bitcoin price and the fact that hash rate follows price. So this is why it's incredibly important to have large scale, low cost power. And that's what's caused so many miners to take and start looking outside of China for lower cost power in other regions in the world. So the next thing we're going to look at here is just a little bit about the fundamentals of power grids and how that can interact with Bitcoin. So when it comes to power grids, the amount of power that's being put into the grid at any point in time has to be matched with the amount of power that's taken out. If you're putting in too much or too little power, you can cause failures in the grid that can lead to loss of infrastructure or even loss of life. So it's critically important that you keep these two sides balanced. And historically, the demand of power has been variable, but the supply has been able to change to meet that demand. So when you have fossil fuel power, you can change the amount of fuel that's being fed into your power plant and match the demand on the grid at any given point in time. Renewables are throwing a bit of a wrench in that, and that renewables, you still have variable demand, but now the supply is variable as well. So this creates a mismatch where it can be difficult to balance grids that have significant amounts of intermittent renewables. So if we look at the history of some grid balancing technologies, on the supply side, you have options like peaker plants, batteries, or supply side curtailment. So peaker plants are expensive. They're basically power plants that you build just to run a few hours out of the year. So they're not nearly as efficient as a power plant that's running all the time. But if that's your only option, it's still much better than having an unstable grid. Batteries today don't have the scale or the economics that are necessary to really be effective at balancing grids. And then the other thing that we see on the supply side is supply side curtailment. So this is basically when you see an overproduction of renewables, it's often the case that some of that renewable production will have to be curtailed in order to in order to not feed too much power into the grid. So this is not good for the renewables since they don't get to realize the economic value of that power. On the demand side, there's a couple options here. So the best thing that you want is a controllable load. So this is essentially a load that can match the grid, can tune up and down in accordance with how much power is available and can help balance the grid. The next best thing is a flexible load. So this is a load that you could take and shift from one time a day to another time a day, or from one day to another. This is another way that you can potentially relieve stress on grids when there are times of extreme stress, but they're not quite as flexible as a controllable load. And then the last option here is curtailment, and this is essentially like like triage, but for power grids. So you decide who has to turn off first in order to save the rest of the loads. So this is basically you turn off some people before other people in order to avoid turning off power to the areas that would lead to the most amount of damage or potential loss of life. So if you look at one of the types of industry that can do this is large scale like aluminum smelting. There are multiple different types of industry that can do this, but large scale aluminum smelters, some of them will take and increase or reduce the amount of power that they're consuming in order to match power on the grid. And this can create a significant amount of benefit for your grid. So for example, this is a German aluminum smelter that has the ability to create over a gigawatt hour of flexible capacity. So this is far bigger than any battery in the world. One interesting way that you can achieve this is with computers. So traditional data centers actually do this today. There are a lot of data centers that act as a grid balancer, but the primary limitation on this is that only non-essential tasks can be shifted. So if you're, for example, running the servers for a bank or a website, it's not acceptable for those servers to be down just because the grid was stressed at some point in time. Those are mission critical operations. So it's only the sort of tasks that can be shifted from one time of day to another or from one day to the next that can be that you can use to do grid balancing with a traditional data center. One of the great things about Bitcoin mining is that there is no single location that is essential to the functioning of the network. So the fact that Bitcoin mining is decentralized around the globe means that any specific location does not have to be online in order for the network to function. So every Bitcoin mining location can act as a grid stabilizer. Now, the limitation on this is that Bitcoin mining only works in areas that have very low cost of power. So Bitcoin miners can really only stabilize grids in areas that already have very low cost of power. So this is one of the reasons why you've been probably hearing so much about Texas lately. So there's 3 power grids in the US. There's the Western interconnection, the Eastern interconnection, and the Texas interconnection. So Texans love to do things their own way. They have their own power grid. Texas deregulated the production of electricity in 2002. And this has led to a massive boom in renewables. So there's today about 30 gigawatts of installed wind and solar in Texas. And this has led to very cheap energy prices, but also very volatile energy. So Bitcoin miners are able to serve this function, which is one of the reasons why Texas has been so attractive to Bitcoin miners. So you have this grid that both has very cheap power, but also has a very high level of intermittent renewables. So it's a very interesting opportunity for Bitcoin miners. If we look on a worldwide basis, Bitcoin mining had been centralized in China with the development of ASICs. And you saw a very rapid centralization with miners seeking to be close to supply chains and being able to plug in ASICs very quickly. Today, we're seeing that trend reverse, and I think this is a really good thing for Bitcoin. As Hashrate continues to move out of China, what we'll see is that we'll see Hashrate become more distributed throughout the globe. And it's going to be necessary for Hashrate to be distributed throughout the globe in order for Bitcoin to become a true global financial asset. In order to have investors from countries and all over the planet take Bitcoin seriously, you're going to have to see Hashrate be decentralized. You can't have any single one country controlling more than 50% of your hash rate. And because what you do is you introduce existential risks to Bitcoin. A huge part of the reason why Bitcoin is valuable is the fact that there is no central authority that controls it. It is the fact that you have this decentralized currency that is not controlled by any single person. So any sort of centralization poses a risk to that value proposition. So I think it's important for all of us that this trend continues. And I think that given the incentives and the game theory around Bitcoin mining, I think it's highly likely that we're going to continue to see hash rate move out of China and move towards areas that have lower cost power. feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. I'm happy to discuss any of these points here, or if anybody has feedback, happy to open up the discussion. So I guess we'll go to questions now. So it looks like we have a question from Albert on hash rate. And so yeah, to be clear here, hash rate is not controlled entirely by the price of Bitcoin. So hash rate primarily follows Bitcoin price, but there are some other parts that also determine the amount of hash rate that you see online. So for example, the efficiency of ASICs on the market is going to determine the amount of hash rate. So it's efficiency of ASICs, the cost of power of the different producers that own those ASICs, and the investment horizon. So essentially, as Bitcoin miners take longer positions in Bitcoin mining, you would expect hash rate to increase because they don't expect the same return. So, if you look 3 or 4 years ago, everybody was expecting returns in Bitcoin under 12 months. And as that horizon gets pushed out, you're starting to see people accept returns that are lower, and therefore still invest in Bitcoin mining even when hash rate is higher than it was in the past. Do we have any other questions here? We had a question on the difference between hash rate and difficulty. So difficulty is essentially, it's sort of like a 2-week average of hash rate. So so difficulty is the amount of work that has to be done to find a block on average, and hash rate is the amount of computing power that's online. So you'll see hash rate will vary significantly more than difficulty does. Difficulty adjusts in a step function. So every 2016 blocks, you get a difficulty adjustment, and difficulty will adjust either up or down based on how long it took to find blocks in the previous era. So we also had a question on the cost of electricity in China. So the cost of electricity in China is highly seasonal. So there in the wet season, you see a lot of cheap hydropower, but then that hydropower goes away during the dry season. So you'll see Bitcoin miners move to regions like Xinjiang and Inner Mongolia for the dry season. And what you'll find is that China has, in a worldwide scale, pretty low cost of power. But there are regions that have lower cost of power, more similar to China's wet season costs, but year round. Does that answer your question there? So there got another question from Albert on network hash rate. So there are multiple sources for network hash rate. I think CoinShares produces some stuff, blockchain.com. There are a bunch of different groups that produce hash rate estimates. And essentially those hash rate estimates are calculated based on difficulty and the amount of time that it took to find blocks. So there's some natural variance in those estimates, since there's a bit of randomness in the distribution of block times, but overall those track together in the long term. Any other questions here? Happy to address any points or answer any questions. So we got a question on, do you see many effective economic mining operations that would just work at night when electricity is cheap? So one of the difficulties with this is that, so Bitcoin mining is a very cost competitive industry. So it is true that Bitcoin miners don't require 100% uptime in the way that a traditional data center would. Bitcoin miners do require very high utilization factors. And this is because the cost of all that equipment, if you have a lot of supporting infrastructure in terms of substations, transformers, your electrical gear, all of your fans, your mechanical system, your building, and all of that has to be amortized over the number of hours that you're running your equipment. So if you only can run your equipment for half the amount of time, you effectively have twice the cost of that supporting infrastructure. So the difference between having 100% uptime or 95% uptime is not huge, but even very cheap power, it's very difficult to get an economic mining situation if you're only having half the time that you're running. We got a question on India, and I'm not an expert on the Indian market as far as electricity there or the regulatory situation. So I don't think I'm the person to answer that one. So we got a question about setting up solar and wind off grid. So you can potentially set up a wind and solar project. One of the difficulties with this is that your typical Bitcoin mining investment and your typical wind or solar investment have very different investment timelines. So a typical wind and solar investment is a 20 to 40 year investment. So it's a very long-term focus, and you put out a lot of capital that expects a pretty low return. Bitcoin mining is pretty different in that you've got a significant amount of capital up front, and you have a much faster return timeline. But then you're seeing much more risk than something with like setting up solar with a PPA. So I think eventually this is something that you will see, where you'll see Bitcoin miners starting to procure their own energy sources. But I think today the timelines don't quite match up. So you got a question about how much do Bitcoin miners care about stable profits? So Bitcoin miners, it obviously varies by who your investors are, what sort of, there's some people that are doing speculative Bitcoin mining versus some people that are taking more of a longer term approach to Bitcoin mining. I think that anybody who's getting into Bitcoin mining has to know that their profits are going to be volatile. There's some amount of hedging that you can do, but today those markets don't have the sort of timeframes that would be necessary to really hedge an entire mining project. I think, so you also mentioned that miners in China are willing to relocate depending on the season. Definitely, I think your Bitcoin miners will chase cheapest power in the world, even if it requires them moving multiple times. So in China, you'll see miners that move, every year they'll move for the dry season and for the wet season. And in fact, a lot of the hash rate that you're seeing come outside of China is still Chinese Bitcoin miners that are just investing in other countries that have cheaper sources of power. So got a question on many investors focus on the price of token in the short term instead of the real value of the project. Can you tell us the motivation and benefits for investors in the long term? So this is one of the main differences between investing in Bitcoin and investing in Bitcoin mining. So an investment in Bitcoin is an investment with with the idea that over the long term, Bitcoin is going to become more valuable. An investment in Bitcoin mining is more of an investment if you look at this from the perspective of like any other commodities market. Your investment is based on the idea that your cost of production will be lower than the cost of production of the marginal producer, and that over the long term, your profitability in mining is less dependent on the specific price of the commodity good and more dependent on the relative cost of production of you and other players. So long-term investments in Bitcoin mining are more investments in the cost of, in looking at what sort of cost of power and what sort of scale of operations can you get in an area. And they're less dependent on the price of Bitcoin. So obviously Bitcoin miners do better when Bitcoin is high. And but low-cost miners can mine Bitcoin in low price environments as well as in high price environments. The interesting upshot of this, though, is that your marginal miners are heavily dependent on Bitcoin price. So if you're sort of just an average Bitcoin miner that is hosting at a facility and you're paying a lot of markup on your electricity, what will happen is your margin could, so for example, if mining revenue is at 10 cents a kilowatt hour and you're paying 6 or 7 cents for your hosting, then even a relatively small drop in Bitcoin price can lead, so for example, in that case, a 30 or 40% drop in Bitcoin price can lead to a 100% drop in your margin. So it's very easy for a person on that part to become unprofitable on a marginal basis. Versus if you have very low cost power, so say, for example, your power is in the 1 to 2 cent range, then it would take a 90% drop in Bitcoin to have the same effect. But in that case, if you actually had a 90% drop in Bitcoin, all of those marginal producers are turning offline, which means that the producers that are left over now are competing at a lower difficulty level. So at that lower difficulty level, even that lower Bitcoin price, so if you have a 90% drop in Bitcoin price, you won't see a 90% drop in revenue in that case. So there was a question, is it crucial for your business that Bitcoin price increase? So for miners, this depends on where you are on the cost curve. So miners at the bottom of the cost curve, it's not critical that Bitcoin price increase. Bitcoin price could increase or decrease as long as Bitcoin stays around in some capacity that's large enough to support the market. Then low-cost Bitcoin miners will continue to make money. Higher cost Bitcoin miners are more speculative. So the amount that their profitability goes up a lot when Bitcoin price goes up. So this is, for example, like if you're a person and you're hosting your machines at a mining farm, you're not paying for all of the extra infrastructure that, or at least not paying up front for all the rest of the infrastructure that goes into supporting those ASIC miners. So what this does is this means that in times when Bitcoin price goes up, you got to invest mostly in Bitcoin miners. So when Bitcoin price goes up, you get a lot more exposure to the upside. But conversely, when Bitcoin price goes down, now you're still stuck paying for that infrastructure over time. And now that, because you don't own that infrastructure, now your level of revenue can fall below your marginal cost of operations, which is why you see a lot of these mining farms shut off over time. So in times when we see big pullbacks in Bitcoin price, or for example, at the halving with the reduction in block reward, we saw a big reduction in hash rate because of these marginal producers turning offline. So we got a question on what would be the most important issue to solve to truly decentralize Bitcoin mining. So I think that, so there's a couple little issues, and some of them have already been solved. So the commoditization of ASICs was a big one. When there were a few producers that produced all the ASICs, and being close to those producers meant that you had a big advantage, this was what caused so much centralization in Bitcoin mining. That trend is reversing, but we're still seeing mostly a big centralization of mining in China. And a big reason for this is that China has a huge head start. I mean, they've had industrial scale mining for many years before it's been popular in the West. So I think that over time, what needs to happen to truly decentralize Bitcoin is that we need to see more Western investment. We need to see the sorts of institutions built around mining that exist in China today in order to facilitate that investment. And we have to see projects tailored to US investors. So we have to, large Bitcoin projects that are going to be competitive in terms of cost of energy and other OpEx need to have a significant amount of capital. And in order to get that capital, you have to get institutional capital. But in order to get institutional capital to invest in any sort of project, it needs to be an institutional quality project. So this means that you have to have all of the sorts of compliance and auditing and a lot of the sorts of more traditional business structures that are not common in Bitcoin mining today, in order to be able to access that sort of capital.
Cool, Jesse, this was really great. So we're going to transition to our next session now. Would you mind dropping in your Twitter account so people can follow you or ask questions?
Sure.
Awesome. Perfect. Thanks so much. We're going to transition to our next talk now.
Sounds great. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.